The rain fell steadily as Dr. Alan Carter walked into the lab. His shoes squeaked against the tiled floor, leaving faint watermarks behind him. He paused at the doorway, taking off his glasses to wipe away the droplets clinging to them. The air inside was cool, almost too cold for comfort, but that didn't bother him. It never did. For years he had spent countless nights in this very lab, chasing answers to questions most people wouldn't dare ask. Tonight was no different. Across the room, Dr. Laura Bennett stood hunched over a workbench, adjusting the settings on a small device. Her fingers moved quickly, tightening screws and securing wires. She glanced up briefly when she heard Alan enter, giving him a nod before returning her focus to the task at hand. The two of them worked well together, their skills complementing each other perfectly. Alan handled the theoretical side of things, the big ideas and abstract concepts, while Laura brought those ideas to life through engineering and practical solutions. Together they were attempting something unprecedented. On the table between them lay the object of their experiment. A coffin. Not just any coffin, though. This one was specially designed, its interior lined with sensors and recording equipment. At the heart of it all was a tiny, waterproof camera attached securely to the lid. Its lens pointed downward, ready to capture whatever might happen once the coffin was sealed shut. The idea had come to Alan months ago, sparked by a question that had haunted him since childhood. What happens after death? Was there truly nothing? Or could consciousness linger even after the body stopped functioning? Laura straightened up, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "It's ready," she said simply, stepping back to admire their handiwork. Alan crossed the room, peering into the coffin. "Are you sure about the camera? We can't afford any malfunctions." She rolled her eyes slightly, though there was no real irritation in her tone. "Relax, Alan. I've triple-checked everything. The camera will record both video and audio even in complete darkness. If anything happens, we'll know." He nodded, still feeling uneasy. There was so much riding on this experiment, not just their careers, but potentially groundbreaking discoveries about human consciousness. They weren't just testing technology, they were exploring the unknown. And the unknown had a way of making itself felt long before anyone understood it. The subject of their study was Ethan Gray, a man in his mid-50s who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. When approached about participating in the experiment, Ethan hadn't hesitated. "If my death can help answer some of these big questions," he'd told them during their initial meeting, "then count me in." His willingness to volunteer had surprised both Alan and Laura, though neither admitted it aloud. Most people shied away from discussions about mortality, let alone volunteered to be buried alive, even if only metaphorically, for science. Ethan's funeral was scheduled for later that evening. Afterward, his coffin would be transported to a nearby cemetery, where it would be lowered into the ground. Once sealed inside, the camera would begin transmitting data wirelessly to the lab. For the next several days, or however long the battery lasted, they would monitor every second of footage, hoping to catch glimpses of something. Anything. As the clock ticked closer to departure time, Alan found himself pacing nervously around the lab. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with forces beyond their understanding. What if the camera picked up more than they bargained for? What if Ethan's consciousness somehow lingered, trapped in the coffin, aware of his surroundings? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. "You're overthinking again," Laura said, breaking through his thoughts. She leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed. "We've gone over every possibility. The worst-case scenario is that we get nothing. No sounds, no movement, no evidence of consciousness. That's it." "But what if we do?" Alan countered. "What if there's something else, something we aren't prepared for?" Laura sighed, pushing herself upright. "Then we deal with it. That's why we're doing this, to find out. You wanted answers, remember?" He nodded reluctantly. She was right, of course. This whole project had been his idea, born out of years of frustration with the limitations of traditional research methods. Yet now, standing on the brink of discovery, doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. The drive to the funeral home was quiet. Neither spoke much, lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the rain continued to fall, creating streaks across the windshield. By the time they arrived, the service was already underway. Friends and family gathered under umbrellas, paying their respects to a man whose final act would leave a lasting impact on the world. Afterward, Alan and Laura supervised the loading of the coffin onto a hearse. They exchanged brief words, with Ethan's wife offering condolences while carefully avoiding mention of the experiment. She seemed grateful for their presence, unaware of the secret hidden within the polished wood. At the cemetery, the burial proceeded without incident. As the coffin descended into the earth, Alan activated the camera remotely via a handheld device. A small green light blinked twice, signaling that the system was operational. Then, silence. The grave was filled in, and the mourners dispersed, leaving the site deserted. Back at the lab, Alan and Laura settled in front of their monitors, preparing to review the first batch of footage. Hours passed uneventfully. The screen displayed nothing but darkness, interrupted occasionally by muffled sounds as dirt settled above the coffin. It was exactly what they expected, but also strangely disappointing. "It's going to take time," Laura reminded him, sensing his impatience. "We're not going to see anything dramatic right away." "I know," Alan muttered, leaning back in his chair. "But part of me hoped—" "Hoped what?" she asked gently. "That maybe we'd catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. Proof that consciousness doesn't just vanish." Laura smiled faintly. "Science isn't about hope, Alan, it's about patience. Let's give it a few more hours before jumping to conclusions." So they waited. And as the hours stretched into days, the monotony of the footage began to weigh on them. But deep down, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something inevitable. Something terrifying. The first sign that something unusual was happening came on the third night. Alan had been dozing off in his chair when Laura's sharp intake of breath jolted him awake. He blinked groggily, rubbing his eyes as he turned to look at her. She was leaning closer to the monitor, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. "What is it?" Alan asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Listen," she whispered, pointing at the screen. At first, all Alan heard was the same muffled silence they'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. But then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, there was a sound. It wasn't loud or clear enough to make out words, but it was definitely there. A whisper, soft and distant, like wind brushing against leaves. Alan sat up straighter, suddenly wide, awake. "Is that interference?" he asked, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. Interference didn't sound like voices. "I don't think so," Laura replied, her tone cautious. "It's too consistent, too deliberate." They replayed the clip several times, adjusting the volume and filtering out background noise. With each pass, the whispers grew clearer, though they remained unintelligible. Still, the fact that they existed at all sent a chill down Alan's spine. This wasn't supposed to happen. Coffins were sealed environments. There shouldn't have been any source of sound beyond the initial burial process. "This could be residual brain activity," Alan suggested after a long pause. "Maybe Ethan's mind wasn't completely gone yet when we buried him." Laura frowned, tapping her fingers absently on the desk. "But if that's true, how does that explain the clarity of these sounds? Brain activity doesn't produce audible noise. Not like this." Alan didn't have an answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The implications were staggering. If the whispers weren't coming from Ethan's brain, or worse, if they were, then what did that mean? Were they dealing with some kind of post-mortem consciousness? Or was there another explanation entirely? Over the next few hours, more clips surfaced. Each one contained variations of the same phenomenon: whispers, murmurs, and occasionally louder bursts of sound that resembled human speech. Sometimes the voices sounded calm, almost soothing. Other times they were frantic, bordering on hysterical. One particular segment stood out. In it, the whispers coalesced into a single phrase, repeated multiple times. "Help me." Laura froze when she heard it. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" Alan nodded, his throat dry. Yeah, I heard it. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. They had set out to explore the mysteries of death, but now it felt like they were intruding on something sacred and possibly dangerous. We need to show this to someone else, Laura said finally, breaking the silence. Someone who specializes in paranormal phenomena. We can't handle this alone. Alan hesitated. Bringing in an outsider meant risking exposure, not just of their experiment, but of its ethical implications. What would people think if they found out they had essentially spied on a dead man's final moments? And yet, Laura was right. They couldn't ignore what they were hearing. Whatever was happening inside that coffin was far beyond their expertise. Early, the next morning they contacted Dr. Emily Dawson, a paranormal investigator known for her work on unexplained phenomena. Emily agreed to meet them at the lab later that day, bringing with her a portable audio analyzer and a skeptical attitude. When she arrived, Alan and Laura wasted no time showing her the footage. Emily listened intently, her expression unreadable, as she processed the information. When the clip ended, she removed her headphones and placed them carefully on the table. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully. "This is interesting. That's one way to put it," Laura muttered under her breath. Emily ignored the comment, focusing instead on the data. "I've seen cases where people claim to hear voices from beyond the grave, but those are usually subjective experiences. This," she gestured toward the monitor. "This is different. These sounds are real, tangible." "But what are they?" Alan pressed. "Are they coming from Ethan, or is it something else?" Emily hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Honestly, I don't know. But based on my experience, I'd say you're dealing with something outside the realm of conventional science. Maybe it's residual energy. Maybe it's something trying to communicate. Or maybe—" She stopped abruptly, shaking her head. "Maybe what?" Laura prompted. "Maybe you've opened a door you shouldn't have," Emily finished quietly. "There are things in this world we don't fully understand, forces that exist beyond our comprehension. If you're not careful, you might attract attention you don't want." Her warning hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. For the rest of the day, Alan and Laura worked in uneasy silence, analyzing every second of footage for clues. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frequent. At times, they seemed to respond to specific stimuli, like when Alan accidentally knocked over a cup of coffee, causing a sudden spike in volume. Other times, they appeared random, disconnected from anything happening in the lab. Then, late that evening, something changed. As they reviewed a new batch of recordings, the camera captured movement. Not subtle vibrations or shifting shadows, but actual, deliberate motion. Something, or someone, was moving inside the coffin. Laura gasped, grabbing Alan's arm. "You see that?" He nodded, his heart pounding. On the screen, the camera lens revealed faint outlines of shapes shifting within the confined space. The movements were jerky and unnatural, as if whatever was making them lacked proper control of its limbs. Then, just as quickly as it started, the activity stopped. "What the hell was that?" Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Laura admitted, her grip tightening on his arm. "But I don't think it's Ethan." The realization hit them both simultaneously. If the movements weren't caused by Ethan's body, and they couldn't be given the state of decomposition, then what was causing them? Was it some kind of external force manipulating the environment? Or was there something else buried in the ground with him? As the hours dragged on, the tension in the lab became unbearable. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights made them jump. Even Emily, who prided herself on her composure, seemed visibly shaken. "You need to shut this down," she said firmly, standing up. "Whatever you've tapped into, it's not natural and it's not safe." Alan shook his head. "We can't stop now. We're too close. There has to be an explanation." Emily sighed, looking at him with a mixture, and stopped. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and mounting dread. Alan and Laura barely left the lab, consumed by the need to understand what was happening inside Ethan's coffin. The whispers had grown louder, more frequent, and increasingly coherent. At first, they sounded like fragments of sentences, words strung together without context, but soon they began forming phrases that sent chills down their spines. One evening, as Laura adjusted the audio settings on her computer, she froze. Her hand hovered over the mouse, trembling slightly. "Alan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Come listen to this." He hurried over, pulling up a chair beside her. On the screen, the footage played silently, showing nothing but darkness. But through the speakers came a voice, clear, deliberate, and unmistakably human. It spoke just 2 words: "Let me out." Alan felt his stomach drop. He replayed the clip several times, each repetition making the message feel more urgent, more desperate. "Is that Ethan?" he asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. I don't think so," Laura said softly. "Ethan's body isn't capable of producing sound anymore. This is something else." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. Whatever, or whoever, was speaking, it wasn't bound by the laws of biology or physics, and it wanted out. As if sensing their unease, the whispers grew louder, overlapping one another in a cacophony of voices. Some pleaded for help, others screamed in rage. Then, cutting through the chaos, came a deeper, more menacing tone. "You shouldn't have come here." Laura jumped, nearly knocking over her coffee cup. "Did you hear that?" Alan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." The phrase repeated itself multiple times throughout the footage, always in the same chilling monotone. It was as if the entity, because that's what it had to be, was trying to warn them. But about what? And why now? Desperate for answers, they decided to dig deeper into the recordings. Using advanced software, they isolated individual voices and analyzed their patterns. What they found shocked them. While some of the voices seemed to originate from within the coffin, others appeared to come from outside it, as if someone, or something, was standing above the grave, watching and waiting. "This doesn't make sense," Alan muttered, rubbing his temples. "How can there be external sounds when the coffin is buried 6 feet underground?" "I don't know," Laura admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "But whatever it is, it's not natural." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden burst of static from the speakers. Both turned toward the monitor where the footage had abruptly shifted. The camera lens, which had been capturing only darkness, now showed faint flashes of light. They were brief, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Something was illuminating the interior of the coffin. "What the hell is that?" Alan exclaimed, leaning closer to the screen. Before Laura could respond, the lights flickered overhead, plunging the lab into near darkness. For a split second, the room was bathed in an eerie red glow, casting long shadows across the walls. When the power stabilized, the footage resumed playing, but the coffin was no longer empty. Faint outlines of figures moved within the confined space, their forms distorted and unnatural. They twisted and contorted, defying logic and anatomy. One figure appeared to claw at the camera lens, its elongated fingers scraping against the glass. Another loomed in the background, its face obscured by shadow. Laura covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with terror. "This isn't possible. We're missing something," Alan said, his voice shaking. "There has to be an explanation." But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't rationalize what they were seeing. The movements were too deliberate, too intelligent to be random fluctuations or equipment malfunctions. It was as if the coffin had become a portal, a gateway to something far darker than they could comprehend. Determined to uncover the truth, they reached out to Dr. Emily Dawson again. Though reluctant to get involved further, she agreed to meet them at the lab. When she arrived, they showed her the latest footage, including the flashes of light and the disturbing silhouettes. Emily watched in stunned silence, her usual composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. "This changes everything," she said finally, her voice low and steady. Whatever you've tapped into, it's not just residual energy or post-mortem consciousness. This is something else. Else? Alan echoed, his frustration boiling over. What does that even mean? It means, Emily replied, turning to face him, that you've attracted something. Something ancient. Something powerful. Her words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Neither Alan nor Laura dared to ask what she meant, not because they didn't want to know, but because they feared the answer. Over the next few hours, Emily helped them analyze the data, searching for patterns or connections that might shed light on the phenomenon. She noticed something peculiar. The voices and movements corresponded to specific dates and times. Each event occurred exactly 3 days after the previous one, suggesting a cyclical pattern. It's marking time, Emily explained, pointing at the timeline on the screen. Whatever this is, it's biding its time. For what? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. For you to finish what you started, to open the door wider. The implication was clear. By placing the camera inside the coffin, they had unknowingly invited something in. Something that thrived on curiosity and fear, something that fed on the living. As dawn approached, the lab grew quieter, the tension giving way to exhaustion. But even as they prepared to rest, the footage continued rolling. And then, just before sunrise, the camera captured something that would haunt them forever. On the screen, the coffin lid creaked open slowly, revealing a pair of glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. The voice that followed was calm, almost soothing, but laced with malice. "We're waiting for you." Alan and Laura exchanged horrified glances. They knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The discovery of the glowing eyes on the footage left Alan and Laura shaken. Neither slept that night or even tried to. Instead, they sat in silence, staring at the monitor as if waiting for the next terrifying revelation. But nothing came. The feed had gone completely black after the eerie message. "We're waiting for you." It was as if whatever was inside the coffin had decided it had said enough, for now. By morning, the weight of what they'd witnessed pressed down on them like a physical force. They knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening wasn't confined to the recordings. It was real, alive, and growing bolder. Something needed to be done, and soon. "We have to dig it up," Alan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was firm but tinged with desperation. Laura looked at him sharply. "Are you serious? We don't have a choice," he interrupted, his tone rising. "That thing isn't going away. It's getting stronger. If we leave it buried, who knows what will happen next?" She hesitated, biting her lip. He was right, of course. Ignoring the problem wouldn't make it disappear. But digging up the coffin felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Still, she nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it." They contacted a local excavation team, fabricating a story about needing to relocate Ethan's remains due to unforeseen circumstances. The workers arrived mid-afternoon, unaware of the true nature of their task. As they began digging, Alan and Laura stood nearby, their hearts pounding with every scoop of dirt removed. When the coffin finally emerged from the ground, both scientists held their breath. The lid was slightly ajar, creaking open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within. One of the workers reached out to push it closed, but Alan stopped him. "Wait," he said, his voice tight. "Let me check something first." He approached cautiously, shining his flashlight into the gap. What he saw made his blood run cold. The camera lay broken inside, its casing scratched and dented as though someone, or something, had tried to pry it loose. Claw marks marred the surface of the coffin, deep gouges that couldn't have been caused by anything natural. Laura stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. Her hand flew to her mouth. What did this?" Alan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. Nothing living could have survived inside that coffin. Not for days, not without air or sustenance. And yet the evidence suggested otherwise. The workers finished securing the coffin and prepared to transport it back to the lab. Alan and Laura followed behind in silence, their thoughts consumed by dread. When they arrived, they wasted no time examining the interior. Every detail confirmed their worst fears. The scratches, the shattered camera, the unnatural wear on the wood. But there was one detail neither of them noticed until later. As they reviewed the condition of the coffin under better lighting, Laura spotted something tucked beneath the lining. She pulled it free, a Polaroid photograph, dusty and creased, as though it had been hidden intentionally. On the front was an image of a long, dimly lit hallway. At the far end stood a figure, its face obscured by shadows. It was looking directly at the camera. "What is this?" Alan asked, his voice barely. Above a whisper, Laura flipped the photo over. Scrawled across the back in shaky handwriting were 2 words. "Find me." Her hands trembled as she held it up for him to see. "This wasn't here before. I'm sure of it." Alan took the photo, studying it closely. The hallway looked familiar, though he couldn't place why. The figure, however, sent a chill through him. Its posture was unnervingly human, yet something about it felt wrong. "This isn't random," he said finally. "Whoever or whatever is doing this, it wants us to follow." "But where?" Laura asked, her voice cracking. "And why?" Neither had an answer. All they knew was that the game had changed. They were no longer passive observers. They were participants drawn deeper into a mystery they didn't fully understand. Over the next few days, strange occurrences plagued the lab. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Monitors displayed static-filled images of shadowy figures, lurking in corners. Even outside the building, things felt off. Both scientists reported hearing footsteps echoing behind them when no one was there. Laura began noticing faint whispers whenever she was alone. Voices too soft to understand, but loud enough to unsettle her. Desperate for guidance, they turned once again to Dr. Emily Dawson. When she arrived, they showed her the photograph and recounted everything that had happened since unearthing the coffin. To their surprise, Emily didn't dismiss their concerns outright. Instead, she studied the photo intently, her expression grim. "This hallway," she said slowly, pointing at the image. "It looks like the old Oak Ridge Asylum. It's abandoned now, but people say it's haunted." "Haunted?" Alan echoed skeptically. "You think ghosts are behind all this?" "I don't know what to call it," Emily admitted. "But places like that, places filled with pain and suffering, they attract energy. Negative energy. If whatever's connected to your experiment is tied to such a location, then we need to tread carefully." Despite her warnings, Alan insisted they investigate. "If this thing wants us to find it, then maybe confronting it is the only way to stop it." Laura reluctantly agreed, though fear gnawed at her insides. Together they gathered supplies and set out for the asylum under the cover of nightfall. The drive was long and silent, each mile bringing them closer to the unknown. When they finally arrived, the building loomed before them like a monolith of decay. Windows were shattered, walls crumbled, and vines snaked through cracks in the concrete. A rusted sign hung crookedly above the entrance, reading, "Oak Ridge Asylum, closed 1987. Inside, the air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of mildew and rot. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and debris-strewn floors. Every step echoed eerily, amplifying the sense of isolation. "This place gives me the creeps," Laura muttered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "You're not alone," Alan replied, scanning the corridor ahead. They moved cautiously, guided by the image on the Polaroid. The hallway matched perfectly, leading them deeper into the labyrinthine structure. Along the way, they encountered signs of recent activity: footprints in the dust, discarded items, faint scorch marks on the walls, as though someone had been here recently. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl reverberating through the halls. It was followed by the sound of dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate. Panic surged through them, but they forced themselves to keep moving. At the end of the hallway, they found what they were looking for. Or rather, who. Standing in the doorway of a crumbling room was the figure from the photograph. Its face remained, shrouded in shadow, but its presence radiated menace. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. Alan raised his flashlight, illuminating the creature. What he saw froze him in place. The moment Alan raised his flashlight, time seemed to slow down. The beam of light cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the figure standing at the end of the hallway. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The creature, if it could even be called that, was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Its form was twisted and grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long and jointed like those of an insect. Its skin, if it had skin, was mottled and gray, stretched taut over, sharp angular bones, but the worst part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where a human face should have been, there was only a void, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to pulse and shift when the light touched it. Deep within that void, two glowing red eyes stared back at them, burning with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. The air around the creature rippled faintly, as if reality itself couldn't quite contain its presence. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature rasped again, its voice layered with multiple tones, some high-pitched and shrill, others low and guttural. It wasn't speaking so much as projecting its words directly into their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. Laura stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Alan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. This thing, it wasn't just alive. It existed on a level beyond comprehension. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something held him rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were struggling against some invisible force keeping it tethered to the ground. Each step sent vibrations through the floor, rattling loose debris and causing dust to rain down from the ceiling. As it moved closer, the temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the walls and floor. "We're not leaving without answers," Alan said suddenly, surprising even himself with the strength in his voice. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, using it like a weapon. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, the motion unsettling and mechanical. For a moment it didn't respond. Then slowly it spoke again. "You opened the door," it said, its tone almost accusatory. "Now you must pay the price." "Pay the price?" Laura echoed, her voice rising in panic. "What does that mean? We didn't ask for any of this." "But you sought it," the creature replied, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "Curiosity brought you here. Curiosity keeps me fed." As it spoke, the symbols carved into the walls began to glow faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the creature's movements. Alan realized with growing horror that these markings weren't random. They formed patterns, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and twist under the light. They weren't just decorations, they were part of whatever ritual or connection had summoned this entity. "This isn't about Ethan," Alan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This has been here all along. Waiting." The creature let out a sound that might have been laughter, though it came out more like a distorted screech. "Waiting," it repeated, taking another step forward. "And now I feast." Before either scientist could react, the room erupted into chaos. The overhead bulb swung violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. The symbols flared brighter, releasing waves of heat that singed the air. Laura screamed as a tendril of shadow shot out from the creature's body, wrapping around her ankle and pulling her toward it. She clawed at the floor, desperate to escape, but the grip was unbreakable. "Let her go," Alan shouted, lunging forward. He swung the flashlight like a club, aiming for the creature's head, or where its head should have been. The beam struck true, momentarily blinding the creature and forcing it to release Laura. She scrambled backward, gasping for breath, while Alan planted himself between her and the advancing monster. "You don't belong here," Alan yelled, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "Leave us alone." The creature paused, tilting its head again. This time, however, its expression, if such a thing could be read, shifted. It seemed amused. "Belong?" it hissed. "I am everywhere, in every whisper, every shadow. You cannot banish me." With that, it lunged forward, faster than either of them could react. Shadows exploded outward, engulfing the room in complete darkness. Alan felt a searing pain in his chest as though icy claws were tearing through his flesh. He collapsed to his knees, clutching at the wound, though no blood came. Beside him, Laura was screaming, her voice echoing endlessly, as if trapped in some endless void. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The darkness receded, revealing the creature standing over them, its form shimmering faintly, as if it were fading. Its red eyes locked onto Alan's, and for a brief moment he saw something in them, not malice but hunger. Hunger for knowledge, for curiosity, for life itself. "You will remember this night," it said softly, its voice reverberating through the empty halls. "And you will tell others. That is how I spread." And with that, it vanished, leaving behind only silence and the faint smell of sulfur. For several minutes, neither Alan nor Laura moved. They sat on the cold, dusty floor, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. When they finally found the strength to stand, they noticed something new. Etched into the wall behind where the creature had stood were fresh symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. At the center of the design was a single word, written in jagged letters: "Return." Neither of them needed to say it aloud. They knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Whatever they had unleashed or awakened, it wasn't done with them yet. By the time Alan and Laura returned to the lab, exhaustion had settled into their bones like a heavy weight. Their clothes were covered in dust, their hands trembling not just from fatigue, but from the lingering fear of what they'd encountered. Neither spoke as they walked through the door, their minds replaying the events at the asylum over and over again. The creature's words echoed in their thoughts. "You will remember this night, and you will tell others." They collapsed into chairs at the desk, staring blankly at the monitors still displaying static-filled footage from Ethan's coffin. Laura broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Alan didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and covering his face with his hands. His mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The whispers, the movements, the glowing eyes. It all led back to one thing: curiosity. Their experiment had opened a door, and now something had slipped through. "We can't ignore it," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Whatever that thing is, it's not going away. It wants us to keep digging." "But why?" Laura asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why does it care about us? About our research?" Alan shook his head. "I don't think it cares about us specifically. I think it feeds on curiosity, on people wanting answers. Every question we ask, every step we take, it gives it more power." Laura frowned, glancing at the monitor. "So what are you saying? That we should stop, after everything we've seen?" "I'm saying we need to be smarter about this," Alan replied, his tone firm. "We can't fight it directly. We saw how that turned out. But maybe we can understand it, learn its weaknesses." For hours they pored over the footage again, searching for anything they might have missed. The whispers, the symbols, the glowing eyes. They analyzed every detail, looking for patterns or connections. And then, buried deep within the recordings, they found something new. In one clip, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was a series of markings etched into the coffin's lining. At first glance, they looked random, like scratches caused by wear and tear. But when they zoomed in, they realized the markings matched the symbols they'd seen in the asylum, the same ones that had glowed ominously before the creature attacked. "This isn't coincidence," Alan muttered, tracing the shapes on the screen with his finger. "These symbols mean something. They're part of whatever summoned that thing." Laura nodded slowly. "Do you think Ethan knew about them? Or did they appear after we buried him?" "I don't know," Alan admitted. But if we can figure out what these symbols represent, maybe we can find a way to control it or at least protect ourselves. Determined to uncover the truth, they reached out to Dr. Emily Dawson once again. When she arrived, they showed her the new discovery. Her reaction was immediate and alarming. She paled, her hands shaking slightly as she studied the markings. "I've seen these before," she said quietly, her voice tinged with dread. "They're binding sigils, used in ancient rituals to contain spirits or entities that shouldn't exist in our world." "Contain?" Alan repeated, his heart sinking. "You mean like trapping them?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "More like anchoring them. These symbols act as conduits, allowing certain forces to cross over, but only partially. They're dangerous, Alan. If you tamper with them without knowing what you're doing, you could make things worse." Despite her warnings, Alan pressed on. "We need to try. If these symbols are connected to the entity, then understanding them might give us leverage." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, researching the origins of the sigils and consulting obscure texts on occult practices. What they learned chilled them to the core. The symbols weren't just tools for summoning, they were warnings. Each one represented a fragment of something far older and more powerful than anything humanity could comprehend. Together, they formed a gateway, a bridge between worlds. As they pieced together the puzzle, strange occurrences continued to plague the lab. Equipment malfunctioned at random intervals. Monitors displayed distorted images of shadowy figures, and faint whispers echoed through the halls even when no one else was around. Both scientists began experiencing vivid nightmares, dreams so real they woke up gasping for air. In each dream, the creature loomed over them, its glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice echoing in their minds long after they woke. The breaking point came one night when Laura disappeared. Alan found her office in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, her chair overturned. On her desk lay a single Polaroid photo, the same hallway from before. But this time Laura was standing at the far end, her expression blank as she stared into the camera. Scrawled on the back of the photo were 3 chilling words. "Find me now." Panic surged through Alan as he realized what had happened. The entity wasn't just observing them anymore, it was taking action. Desperate to save Laura, he grabbed his flashlight and a handheld recorder and headed back to the asylum. The building seemed darker this time, its decayed walls closing in around him as he made his way deeper inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic like blood. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted his presence. As he approached the room where they had last encountered the creature, he heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. When he entered the room, he froze. There, in the center of the space, stood Laura, or what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she were being controlled by an unseen force. Behind her loomed the creature, its form shifting and pulsating, like smoke caught in a breeze. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice layered with malice. "But since you have..." Before Alan could react, the creature lunged forward, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around him. Pain seared through his body as memories, not his own, flooded his mind. Images of endless voids, of whispers calling, out from the darkness of countless others who had dared to seek answers and paid the ultimate price. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. The creature released him, stepping back with an almost satisfied expression. "Tell the world," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the empty halls. "Let them know what waits beyond the veil." With that, it vanished, leaving Alan alone in the darkness. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the recorder tightly. Though battered and broken, he knew one thing for certain. The truth couldn't stay buried forever. When authorities searched the asylum days later, they found only static-filled footage and a single blood-stained notebook. Inside, Alan's final entry read, "Whatever we unleashed, it's not done with us yet."